So we're going to take a couple minutes just to go over the pre-workshop survey that you all received and filled out. There were varying numbers of participants in any given question. So the number varies across questions, but we're just going to run through those and kind of give you a snapshot of where everybody feels they are in this sort of comfort level with FAIR. Also, like things that you all perceive as maybe barriers to producing more FAIR data, or even needs that you've called out. And so I think this will be relatively quick and straightforward, but it's just going to give you a sense of where all of the time series as peers as sort of fall in this FAIR data space. So the first was how familiar you are, and I have to say they were published in 2016, and so they came out of the gate like wildfire. It was really a great way to frame that's mixed metaphors, but it's a great way to frame these concepts of increasing your usability of data, and it was really rapidly adopted. Pierre said they're not really new. They're just sort of collected together in a way that's really accessible and consumable for people to start referencing. So when we at the Oceanographic at Hui, we started to teach a FAIR or data savvy oceanographer, and there are still students who are coming through that don't have this sort of level or concept or socialization to these recommendations for FAIR. So when we get at an early career stage, they're just starting to hear about these concepts, but it was really surprising to see here that everybody is like somewhat familiar with them. And some folks, I hope that's not the data folks that were that 36%, that's a very, but I don't know how many data folks in here or repositories answered this. But it was very promising to see. When we move on to concerns that you all have, they sort of fell out into, hey, we could really use this, or this is hampering me from being able to achieve FAIR. And so some of that was on the side of metadata. We're not all producing the same or level of or types of metadata. Needs for tools, interfaces, visualizations, things that would make FAIR data use easier. Data versioning, we've heard a lot of, even from that 2012 workshop that Heather referenced, how to look at data versioning, but also trace provenance and give credit still comes through. There was at least one answer that said it was achieving FAIR is daunting and we need to break it down into manageable steps. On the barrier side, there's skills limitations that ranks really highly. There's that tracking of data usage, challenges for data getting used that haven't been published yet. How do we tackle that? Inconsistent standards called out as a barrier, and then multiple interpretations of what actually FAIR is and how that gets implemented. So those were the high frequency responses. Looking at how many folks are sharing their time series data. And I think we get into a talk later, I don't know if it's today or if it's tomorrow, about what open actually means and how challenging this sort of spectrum between fully closed and fully open access data sharing is. What are the challenges there? But for the most part, folks are sharing data fully openly, which is also good to hear. A couple of respondents said restricted at least to some degree for either time or purpose. And then 2 repositories said there are some types of their output that are not shared at all. We didn't, I don't think we dug into that reasons for or types of. So biggest barriers to making data open. And remember, maybe it's good to talk about when we get to that open data. Open does not necessarily mean FAIR. They're 2 distinct things. Data can be completely FAIR and not open. And likewise, they could be completely open and really missing the mark on very low on the FAIR spectrum, right? So 2 totally different things here. biggest barriers to open data, and this again looked like some folks were talking about usage of data, and some folks were talking about enabling it to be open. And where there were high frequency, I put parentheses, the number of respondents that sort of got lumped into that topic. So lack of funding, especially for quality assurance and quality control. The cost of sharing big data, and there is a consideration there. The independent data publishing costs, if you were to try and go this alone, or even use a repository. Some repositories, especially in the US, once you reach a certain size, you have to pay for it. Existing culture was the huge one. I kind of lumped this into a lot of these sub bullets here. Cultural differences across disciplines, what it looks like to share your data, what's considered entirely open access, if there's any restrictions on that. Also, I think this is probably lumped into a FAIR component there as well. Fear of getting scooped on unpublished data. That's persistent in all of time. It's just an inherent concern. And I don't know if anybody else in the data space, there's not a lot of research that calls this out as a major concern. So there's not a lot of scooping that's going on, but people do have this inherent fear of it. Need for sharing enforcement, no sharing, no funding. That's a sort of governance and policing issue. And then the last one is timing. It happens after publication. Oftentimes folks don't leave enough time or enough resources in their budget to actually accommodate the publication process. Similar responses, time to do it right, definite need for tools. I think there are some undertones of high frequency responses coming through here. Capacity issue for ensuring that those open data are fair. This was interesting too, and maybe during some free time discussion, folks who are having a hard time or challenges deciding which repositories to use, or, to Al's point, I'm submitting to multiple places, how do I coordinate that? Another response was lack of community standards or domain or disciplinary standards. And that ran across the gamut of quality control, data standards, metadata standards, standards and across repositories for that interoperability layer, and then certainly how we decide to version these things. And then discovery of open data, and a nice follow-on response to that survey response was basically what Pierre presented is a nice avenue for that solution. So data sharing across time series, this was a free text answer in the survey, so it was a little challenging to go through and pull out where everybody happens to be sharing. Heather presented a slide earlier in the intro about all of the time series being represented in the data platforms, and it is quite an international and very eclectic mix of data sharing entities. And some things to note here on this graph are that 4 repositories or 4 respondents mentioned that they share their data through their project site only. So it's a very limited way of getting those data discovered. 2 mentions of only upon request how they share data. And 5 respondents mentioned multiple repositories for sharing. So kind of to Al's point, it's either split by data type or by community where they are deciding to share that. And that's I think that's challenging. It would be great for the repository, the data infrastructure, to talk about that in terms of like where this community sees an authoritative source across countries, or how within your community you decide on your repository. I think there could probably be some streamlining to be had there. And then 1 respondent mentioned that they have a national mandate to share in a particular repository. And so that could be by nation or that could be by funding type as well. And so just some things to consider there as you look across, you know, the time series as a community. Fair approaches and tool use. Not too much to say here. I think we're going to be digging into this through the rest of the time we're together. Certainly, it's great to see that better than 80% of the time series are reporting to some type of metadata standard that they're aware of, regardless of whether you're actually putting it in that standardized metadata format or you're working with a repository to do that. 70% are saying you all use controlled vocabularies, which is really great. Sharing that information and what types of repository, what types of vocabularies you're using can probably really be a useful exercise. Certainly data standards, they all look just really great in terms of the efforts that you're all going to take those steps to get to fair data. Fair approaches and tool use. So this had 13 responses total. Notably, what came out of this that was interesting was the mention of biology several times and down to the degree of taxonomic standards. So, you know, I'm not aware of how many of the time series are taking taxonomic data these days, but there's certainly, you know, potential there to coordinate across the time series on if you're using taxonomic definitions and do those have persistent identifiers. And so there's a, you know, a point of opportunity there. Let's see. Certainly the mention of PIDs and metadata standards. Again, these are things that you may not even know what your repository is doing, but you're supplying the metadata that goes into those standards. So you know, just sort of a series of looking across the time series projects. When it comes to controlled vocabularies, see DataNet, NERC, and WORMS were the ones that were listed almost exclusively. We at Ecodemo depend on the NERC vocabulary to map all of the content that we receive into that controlled vocabulary, and we do reference WORMS. Yeah.
Just real quick.
Yeah.
I interpreted that question as also using internal controlled vocabularies. Instead of having a free text field, always using something like World Ocean Database has its own set of codes.
Yeah.
It helps with translation, but they're not in NERC or.
Yeah, it does help in translation, and NERC does accept new terms. So if there was something that you really felt that could benefit to have the persistent identifier and then socialize it out to the rest of the world. Yeah. Here.
Yeah, you know, that's fine. But you know, in terms of datascape engineering, also for UN bodies, many of them have controlled vocabularies like, you know, PDF somewhere or, you know, CSV. What we're trying to make them do is basically set up their own server that manages them in a more machine-friendly way, like a SCOS server or something. It's true, of course, you can push it into NERC and ask them to run it, but the thing is, NERC doesn't actually have the authority to govern those vocabularies. They will kindly offer the technology to do it, which can work for some time, but in the long term, we always put some positive pressure on those agencies that are issuing vocabularies to actually publish the vocabularies in a machine-friendly way. That would be healthier for the datascape and take some pressure off NERC, because again, they have their own mission. They can't maintain everyone's vocabulary. So it's something to think about. If your organization does maintain good controlled vocabularies, it might be time to set up a server, right, that can interoperate.
Yeah, I think the operative word is a good controlled vocabulary that you're maintaining, and it's not like a static PDF from, you know, decades ago. And repositories here, again, the disciplinary repository space has the expertise to do that mapping. And so even if you submit a consistent controlled vocabulary term into the repository, they can map it out to these more globally used and authoritative sources. So I think there are options.
I just, in terms of 70% of people using controlled vocabularies, I'd be curious how much are like
internal
versus.
Yeah, that's a great point. Todd? Yeah, and then the last piece there is persistent identifier use. And the mentions in the responses were to not necessarily to DOIs or other content like other data sets or accession numbers or anything like that, but they were specifically for biology. So IDIS and APHIA life science IDs for taxonomy. I think that was pretty much it. There was a free text section in that survey for additional comments. And there was some great content in there, so I just thought I'd share it out with you all. One was the interest in a mentorship program, pairing individuals with expertise expertise in the data management side with folks who have questions about how to do it. Time to talk about data visualization, to present a visual narrative, to communicate out the science. And then there was an acknowledgement of skills, and I think that I'll give a shout out to John. This is John Porter's response that John has a poster that describes these two last bullet points, code services that will convert metadata into usable code snippets, and development for controlled vocabulary keywords that link ad hoc units into a unit's ontology. Just great stuff to leverage. And so I'll give a plug for the poster and seeing John's poster tonight. But this was really just to socialize all of you to basically how everybody's tackling this concept of FAIR. And I think we probably have lots of time for Q&A if anybody has additional questions here. Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
I think your second slide showing the data availability. I would be, yeah, keep.
That one, where there's
No, but whether it's publicly available or controlled, that. I'd be really curious on the open access to see a split down of physical versus biological.
Yeah, and that was a response also the cultural differences in I think it was right here. The cultural differences were that, hey, it's really physicists share their data. It's really regular, it's really easy, there's nothing that is sensitive about it. Biologists, they tend to be more reserved in how much and how they share. And you know, that seems really understandable. And I think that primarily the sort of scoop nature on biology and biological phenomenon, as well as, you know, new species, changing species names, but also fisheries dependent data, things that are super ecosystem dependent that folks may not share initially because there are either protected species or, you know, some type of ephemeral nature to the science that they don't want it to be public. So there are community differences in that sharing. Yeah. Justin.
Within that, there's also across oceanography very different cultural perceptions of when observations become. So especially in the biochemical biological communities, there's a lot of work to actually turn those observations, those measurements into ones data. So as opposed to physics, we're on there. Yeah, that transition happens much faster. So that very regularly creates perceptions that they're not sharing data when they are sharing data. It's just different working data.
Right, and there's that latency to the shared point. There's also a distinction of what types, where it becomes research ready versus raw and not necessarily something you want to share versus a clean basically an analysis or a research product.
Just adding to the point there, I think there's even granularity there within physics, right? So, you know, temperature and salinity, all very well understood, well controlled. As soon as things are being calibrated, generally they can go into the open atmosphere. But you know, a counterpoint to that would be something like mixing data, right? Where you know, you do anticipation data, where you know, I've had a situation, you know, I can talk to a personal situation out of this, where you know, you can often get a paper into the submission phase, right? The publication phase, and then because that community has quite a lot of disagreement as to exactly how this stuff should be processed, you can often review stage F on it, you need to reload this way, right? And so there's then often a kind of rush right at the end of the publication phase. Once everyone's happy and once it's right, we can push this now as a final data product across, right? And that's, so I think it's a very fair point that Justine makes, but I think it's not even kind of so binary necessarily between physics and biology, that there are, I would definitely agree with TNS, that's definitely the case, but even within physics, I think it's quite a lot of things. But I think that actually kind of makes an interesting point, is that when you do get those kind of rushes at the end of when papers are coming out, that can be when sometimes the fair principles go a little bit.
I totally agree, yeah. Here and then,
Yeah, and on that point, when we release the implementation plan, we have a very clear definition of what data is, right? And it's not contingent on the community's opinion about what data is. And we learn from NASA and other organizations that have this sort of levels of data, so level 0 going up to products, right? But level 0 data is the stuff that comes right out of the machine, right out of the satellite, etc. Now, it may not be on vogue, it may not be the kind of processing that somebody wants today. But if that raw data is not available, then you're not future-proofing. You're basically captured by the opinions and expertise of today. And that's a bit of hubris in the section. So our encouragement is that release the data in the rawest form, and then you can release derivative forms that have been processed in a certain way, accompanied by the metadata stream to say, okay, we got this level 0 data, did this to it, and we consider this good level 1. 5 years later, somebody might have a different opinion, right? But they can track back to the.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm totally with you. I guess
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just sort of clarifying. I'm saying that in the decade, we're very clear about this, and also clear about the economy of science in terms of crediting for science being out of sync with good practice in terms of data.
totally agree with that point. Publishing doesn't necessarily push for the raw data.
Yeah.
And as long as you have your statistical summaries in there
Yeah, I
and
mean, that-
DOI, then
I mean,
I agree.
I've had it said to me by someone from a journal saying, all we want is the numbers that go into that plot.
yes, yes.
But I don't disagree with all of you, but I mean, it depends on the history of the time series and what the group that is reading the time series sometimes consider that is data or not. For example, yes, I do agree, physical oceanographer process and share the data. By the way, biochemical CO2 community is so organized, so it takes time to process data. You need nutrients, temperature, salinity corrected to pull all the calculations, but then you know what your community is doing, so you can easily create your metadata. But biological data and biological data, when you say biological, it's a huge world. Primary productivity simulations, it's one world, different within chlorophyll. And even like taxonomy. In our group, we are so taxonomists. So taxonomy takes a lot to be processed. And some people think abundance it's enough, and other people think no, we need balance. So people don't share the data because it's okay, I cannot do the biomass calculations because I didn't collect this and this data, and I cannot process that, and you cannot share the data. So I think we need to have these discussions on table, how to be more open and to accept and to discuss within the communities, because we are sharing a lot of variables that owns or belongs to different communities. And I think that's the problem. It's not only that data is not available, it's a problem of different languages sometimes. So you think, like physical oceanographers that always say, oh, why are you sharing the data to the physical oceanography data? I cannot. Because, yeah, I cannot. So I think we need to start talking more about this and saying, I do agree that all the definitions are there, but sometimes communities doesn't really use that definitions.
Yeah, appreciate that.
We have about 5 minutes before we're lunch scheduled, so maybe we'll move into introductions.
Sure.
Final comments.
That sounds great. Yeah. Pierre, do you want to put a bow on it?
Very much on that, but I think this is like what meetings like this are so important for, because, and it's also UNESCO, it's no accident that it's education, science, and culture. We have to normalize this data sharing culture, because if somebody decides, I'm not sharing this because it doesn't satisfy my definition of fitness for purpose, you're depriving the rest of the ocean community from something that could be useful to them even if it wasn't useful for your purpose. And changing that and rewarding that behavior is extremely important here.
Rewards would be great, we can talk about, right? Okay, so I appreciate the comments and we can keep these conversations going and find these sort of high frequency needs and maybe create some space for having those conversations. We have next on the agenda is participant introductions, and Heather, is there a certain way you wanted to see this play out? Like, we know we have representation from how many folks here? Just want to go around the room.
Yeah, why don't we start with all of the time series providers who are here? Stand up, say your name, where you're from, what time series you're here to represent. And then we'll have our data folks come in and do that part of it. So why don't we start with that?
Does this move around?
Yeah, let's pass that around.
Okay, great. There would be
Just slide it.
formal noises. All right, who wants to start? Josh, I'm gonna.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.